Hey, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. This week on our panel, we have Josh Justice.
Hey, everyone.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I'm so excited. I have to say it. My book's going live.
Awesome.
Yay. So if you're on the job market, you want to have a little bit more stability. If you wind up on the job market, go check out the book. It's the Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's on Amazon. We'll put a link in the show notes.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
So, Josh, you brought up this topic, and it was kind of funny while we were discussing it. Yeah, I was a QA engineer in the past before I was a developer, this is something that came up in another conversation that I had with somebody else too, and where's that line between QA and development, right? What are our roles, I guess, is where it comes in. Do you want to clarify that a little bit or add some nuance to it?
Yeah, so I spent about 10 years of my career not doing any automated testing at all. Just point and click and click through and run through it. And I remember an e-commerce website I worked on where I must have gone through the checkout process 500 times by hand as we were coding it. So I worked there where there was a QA team and there was no developer testing at all. And then in the last couple of years, I've worked in an environment where we don't have a QA team, like we just have developer automated testing. And I've been revolutionized by that. It's totally turned my career around in an amazing way. But just now on my latest client project, we have developer automated testing, and we also have a QA department. And they've been doing manual testing up to this point, but they're looking into putting in a QA automation as some of the other apps within this client organization have had. And so we're all coming across this question of what is the role of developer tests versus QA tests? The other thing I should say is, and we can get into this in just a little bit, but as I think is pretty common in mobile development, there's not a lot of developer UI tests or developer end-to-end tests. So this is the idea, the question of even what are our different roles is not something that the organization has gotten into. So I'm looking forward to just us as a team figuring that out. But I wanted to discuss and get your thoughts and the listeners' thoughts on the relationship as well.
Yep, interesting. So let me give a little bit of context here as far as my work in QA. So I started out, I was finishing up college, and I got a full-time job working at a company called Mozy, and it was basically online backup. They were one of the first ones out there. They and Carbonite and a couple of others are now all owned by Dell. And so, yeah, in fact, if you go look up Mozy now, Carbonite was our primary competitor, and now it's Mozy by Carbonite, which is, anyway, it still makes me kind of smile a little bit because I'm like, man, back in the day. Anyway, so I ran the tech support department there for about a year and a half. And by tech support, I mean customer support, right? So we'd answer emails, answer phone calls. And then while I was doing that, I decided, because we'd wind up with the same kind of issues, and then they'd release a new version and we'd still have the same issues. And so I put together a little grid, right? And it was just a Google sheet. And it was, these are all the things that I'm going to test before the next release, right? Because we'd get the releases early. And then I would report the bugs back to the developers, and, that they would sometimes get fixed. And so, and they were trying, but there were only 10 of us in the company. So at the time, that's where things were. Eventually, after a few months, that grew into them hiring a QA consultant to come in and, get things going in earnest. And she came in and she kind of got things rolling and then helped hire another QA person. And I was still running the support department, but I had all the data on, these are our most common problems, right? And so I would hand that off to QA or development at that point. And eventually I'm not going to go into all the politics that happened, but I wound up moving out of support. And I went to my boss because at the same time, I was on the management track. We had just been acquired by EMC Corporation, which later got acquired by Dell. I was on the management track, and the more I got into building the tools we were using, that's how I got into Ruby on Rails. Got into the tools we were building to run support, the more I realized I wanted to be a developer. So I went to my boss and I said, look, I was like, obviously you don't want me in support. So, got handed off to somebody else. And then, how do I get to be a developer? Well, the developers were king in the organization. So he couldn't just put me on the development team. So he put me in QA. And so we ran QA for, I was there for about a year doing QA. And then I eventually left. And I'm not going to go into all those reasons either. But while I was there, what we did is we did a lot of manual testing. It was almost all manual testing. There were tools out there that would allow you to drive the UIs on the desktop or on the web, because there was a web component as well, because that's where you'd go to get you could get them through the client on your desktop machine, but you could also get them on the web and download a giant zip file or something. So, we would test all of that stuff. And, we had big corporate clients like GE running backups through us and stuff. And, I was still kind of the primary point person for support there because I had built relationships with them over the course of the years because I was the senior support guy. And so I wound up on those accounts. So anyway, that's kind of where things went. And yeah, so you kind of got this manual process, and I was pushing them to allow us to script the QA and never quite succeeded at that before I left. So yeah, and half of our team was in India and the other half was in Utah. So that was also another thing that, maybe we can talk about if you have remote QA teams. But that's kind of where we were at. So I've kind of seen this from both ends. And yeah, so there's definitely some nuance there. But yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you're seeing, and then we can kind of, just discuss where this all goes.
Sure. Maybe defining some terms could be useful, because I've heard a number of different terms in this area thrown around.
Right.
And we have different experiences for what it involves. So again, I also have a Rails background. So I know so I imagine you've worked with like Capybara for feature tests or before?
Yeah, Capybara and Selenium WebDriver, a few others.
Yeah. So I know in our spec in the Rails Ruby world, feature test was a common term that was used. And all of these refer to basically, the common ground is walking through steps a user would take, like go to this screen or web page, click on this, type in that, verify that this is on the screen, maybe some getting under the hood and checking stuff in the database as well. But the core that I'm discussing is the UI part. So UI automation tests is another related term. System test kind of emphasizes the fact that it's the whole system altogether being tested.
Right.
Feature test kind of emphasizes that each one is like maybe it's the shopping cart feature and maybe it's the checkout feature. Acceptance test is another term that I've heard from one of the books that was really influential for me, referring to that in a sense, a customer could spell it out, or you could maybe spell it out for the customer, and the customer could see, oh yeah, this is how I want checkout to work. Oh, it does, it passes? Cool, I can accept this feature as working. And then one more term about it that I heard was end-to-end, kind of referring to it's from the user interface, it's actually hitting the database. Maybe it's not 100% end-to-end because maybe you are stubbing out, like you're not actually charging a credit card or whatever. But yeah, are you familiar with all those terms? Do you feel like they're more or less overlapping, or do you see distinctions between those? Do you equate those in your head? Do you see significant differences or differences of emphases between those?
Generally, I think there are accepted definitions for most of these. I do see some nuance in like feature and integration tests. I mean, end-to-end tests are pretty well understood. Some system tests can be, again, a lot of this, and what's funny is a lot of it's defined by the organization, right? Not necessarily even the industry. Yeah. So I've seen different organizations define some of these different ways, like a feature test or an integration test. But as long as everybody's using the same vernacular, you can get away with a lot. So you have to make sure that you have them defined. But yeah, end-to-end and maybe UI automation tests are the only ones that I'm really seeing that have like a well understood, commonly accepted, terminology.
Yeah. We actually had a misunderstanding between me and QA on the term end-to-end testing. So I was using that term because so Detox, one of the testing tools that automates the UI on React Native, refers to itself as an end-to-end testing tool. I'm pretty sure Cypress on the web also does.
Yes.
And yet I was in both cases, so like Cypress has built-in like request response mocking so that you're just testing your, like if you have like a single page app, JavaScript application, for example, you're just testing that and not testing the backend API at the same time, or you can go all the way through.
Right.
Detox doesn't have any stubbing features like that built in. I ended up putting in some features into our app manually to allow stubbing out requests and responses.
Right.
But I was still referring to it as an end-to-end test. Whereas in QA, they were very specifically tasked with, hey, like we need to hit the real staging, API. Yep. We need to verify that an order was correctly placed in another system. So to us, that's end to end. And I was like, like me using that term has caused a misunderstanding here. Sorry about that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because my understanding of end-to-end test is no stubbing. So you're testing the full suite of tools, backend services, the whole 9 yards.
How about if a credit card was being charged? Would you stub that out, or just hit like a sandbox credit card server? Maybe
you hit a sandbox. Yeah.
Gotcha. So it's testing all the real types of systems, and then no stubbing, like you said.
Yep.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So
now that we kind of laid out this category, which is a good amount of overlap for this kind of testing, I'd say as an observation, I've seen it a lot on the web. I mean, Cypress is a tool that's really helped establish. I mean, Selenium has been around for a long time, and there's pros and cons to that. Cypress was created to address a number of the cons, and I'm a really, really, really big fan of Cypress. Ember.js has had it built into their stack. Vue.js in their CLI tool has an option to enable, hey, do you want end-to-end testing or not? You can choose Cypress or another option. So I see it very standard on the web, but UI automation testing, I see it much less commonly on mobile. And at Big Node Ranch, having an Android and iOS team, those folks can speak to the fact that they don't see it very much. Have you done as much or seen as much on the native development side to see if there's a difference in the amount of end-to-end testing that you've seen over there?
I've looked around. I haven't seen a ton of it. And to be perfectly honest, let's see, Microsoft has a product for it. I'm trying to remember. There's Sauce Labs does a bunch of it.
Yep.
So you see it, but generally it's okay. Here's this tool. We're gonna pay for it and set it up, and then it's gonna run through the app, right? So it installs the app and runs.
Right. Yeah, I think there's probably a few different ways to do it, but it installs the app and runs. There's different levels of the whole black box testing versus gray box testing.
Right.
So I was just catching up on that in the documentation because I have a workshop coming up where I want to be able to explain that well. But so Detox for React Native, like Cypress, I'm not sure if Cypress describes itself as gray box testing. I'm pretty sure I've heard that at some point.
I don't know.
Detox does, but the terms, if the listeners are not familiar, the idea of black box in general is like you don't know any of the internals. Like, I'm agnostic to that. I just give inputs and I check outputs. Yep. Whereas gray box kind of like adjusts the metaphor to say, well, like it's not totally isolated. And so in the case of Detox, it actually builds the app slightly differently. I think it puts like a WebSocket connection into the app so that when you're running your test runner from the command line, it's actually communicating over a WebSocket to your application. And that's how it's able to not simulate, but actually execute taps and typing in and things like that. And in those cases, you get a little bit less realism because it's gray box testing that's running not quite the same way.
Right.
But what we've seen as an industry is apps are so feature rich and like asynchronous now that some of the older techniques like Selenium that are totally agnostic, you can just end up with a lot of test flake as a result of like, I didn't know there's an animation still running. I didn't know you had an AJAX request that was still running. And so I found for developer testing that the trade-offs of gray box testing that Detox and Cypress have, they're worth it to get the kind of reliability we want for developer tests.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is something then to be said for the black box testing where effectively somebody, if there is a long running AJAX request or a long running animation or something like that, you're not going to catch those if your gray box test is essentially waiting for them to complete however long it takes, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's a certain UX or customer experience component to that you may miss.
That's a good point. I haven't thought about the benefits of those timeouts happening. It's like, oh, I want that to be visible to me. That's cool.
Yeah. So there are trade-offs.
Yeah. I really see that as a both and thing. Like, and it's tough because I don't, folks are just getting into testing. I don't want to tell them they have to write 17 different types of tests. They certainly don't have to. But when I hear objections like, oh, well, I want maximum realism in my end-to-end tests, or, another thing is Cypress currently only runs on Chrome, and folks want to know their web, well, less these days, but hopefully I encourage folks to want their website to work on Firefox and other browsers. Yes. But I think you could do both and. Just like Cypress recommends, hey, we recommend mostly stubbing the back end, but you can maybe have a few tests that really hit the real back end just to make sure. It's like a spoke test. In the same way, it's like maybe your Cypress test and your Detox test on React Native fully cover all the features of your application, but then maybe you have some Appium is a tool on React Native and other native applications that is black box and runs outside of it and runs on hardware devices, runs across many different devices. So maybe you have some Appium tests, but maybe they don't need to cover every single feature, or maybe they won't fail your build. Maybe you don't run them on CI. You just run those as a part of a QA test suite to get visibility into how it's running on all these different devices. But maybe it's those detox tests that run on CI and they'll fail the build if they're not working, because maybe that gray box testing gives you that higher reliability.
Yeah. Well, the other thing to keep in mind with a lot of these too is that a lot of times the UI automation tests can get a little bit complicated. And the thing that I tell people to look at too is just, what's the ROI, And in this case, what the ROI is mitigating risk. So how much risk are you mitigating here, right? So if it's on the credit card page and the animation takes too long and the user drops out, you're mitigating a lot of risk, right? Because you want them to pay you. But if you're trying to make your end-to-end or your end-to-end, I'm going to use end-to-end and UI automation interchangeably because that's just kind of how I think about some of it. Yeah. But if you're using your UI automation to do your entire app and you want it to all be realistic and blah, 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 it may not be worth the effort for a lot of areas of your app. And so you have to take that into account too and just say, look, if I tap here, eventually I get what I expected. And then, count on your QA team to actually go and work through the UI periodically and, be aware, okay, this is taking a little too long. This is not working as expected. This didn't feel natural to me. And that's something that I don't know if you can write tests for. Like you can write tests for this animation took longer than it should have, right? Because you just benchmark it and you say this benchmark's too high. But the flip side of it is that, this didn't animate in a natural way. You kind of need human eyes on it for that. And so you're going to run into some of that stuff. But yeah, you can test for it. The difference is how much time and effort are you saving a human being to have to go do that? And can your tests accurately represent what you're worried about?
Yeah, that was a bit of feedback from our iOS team when I was asking them about this topic. Like, hey, what are your thoughts on automated testing? One of the things they said was, on mobile and on iOS, like the visual performance, like the expectations are very high. And we try to create apps to a high level standard as well. And so like the animation needs to be smooth. The thing that is always said, and I kind of say as a joke now, is like that table view needs to scroll at 60 frames per second. Like it's all about that table view on iOS. And like 59 frames per second is not okay, because I can tell. Right. And so it's like, if you're going to be manually testing that to see that anyways, like you'll see if the table view crashes. Like, so maybe there's not a lot of cost savings or any cost savings in that case. And even like if the goal is just, hey, well, I just need an end-to-end test just to make sure the app doesn't crash at all, like that actually successfully starts. It's like, well, if you're always going to be manually pulling it up to see it anyways, then maybe you've got that case covered. So yeah, almost always I feel like, being, in some senses kind of a middle of the road person, I feel like the manual testing aspect, there'll always be a little bit of it at least, manually testing the functionality you're working on right now. I actually asked, I think it was somebody over at Wix, the creators of Detox, because I think I heard them talk about in various conference talks about just deployments with like no manual QA. Like we can deploy our stuff with total confidence or like high enough confidence to make it go live. And I was like, but what about 60 frames per second? What about those table views, And I think what they said is that they had interest in automating that as well. in finding ways, maybe, there's visual diffing algorithms now to check if screens have not been changed. And so I think that they described like even thinking about video testing, like, recording the test tools will record the video of your test if you want. And so maybe some ways to automate that if they could see if the frame rate was off. Even with that though, I don't know, like my view is like, okay, maybe you solve for that case, but it's like, you never know all the things that a human testing it is going to find. And even the exploratory testing aspect of it, that's a term that encapsulates some of what you just said, where it's like, hey, like all the things I was looking for as I manually tested this were fine, but I noticed this one thing, like I noticed that this change we asked for actually doesn't make sense anymore. And so like, I mean, unless you have crazy AI in the future, you're never going to be able to automate that. So I definitely don't think that manual testing ever fully goes away, at least to discover things like that.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I is linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I. Yeah, I mean, there is some of that, but to be perfectly honest, I mean, if let's say that you've got these issues solved in version 1.12, right? And then you release version 1.13 and you want to put it out. I mean, maybe you just do it for the major and minor versions or something like that. But, if you're doing a bug fix, you don't need to do this on all of them, right? And so the issue then becomes, and I'll admit, QA teams slow the process down for deployment, right? And so if you can bypass the QA team for, really minor things, then you can continue to move quickly. And then if something does pop up, then you're in a position to just jump on it and handle it, right? And then you can hand it off to QA quickly before you push it out. But, to the point you're making from Wix, they've got enough confidence that the changes that they're pushing out on a regular basis are not going to cause these kinds of issues. And then if they do, then, to a certain degree, I think it is okay to rely on your users to report these issues. I don't know if I'd, 100% rely on them, but that's why you automate the issues, right? So it's okay. Well, we ran into this bug, we fixed the bug, and here's a test that makes sure that we fix, that it's not going to regress. And, so that's, and you hear the term regression testing. That's essentially what it is you put a test in to make sure that, that bug doesn't get reintroduced in some way. And so,
yeah, the point about user
I can see their point of view there too.
Right. Something that I've been learning and interacting with these QA folks is how common it is to have different groupings or tags within your QA automation test suite. And that was less common, at least for the size of applications that I was working on in Rails. It was generally like those acceptance tests, like we generally ran all of them. Maybe there was a few JavaScript enabled ones that we tagged so that we could exclude them if we wanted to, because they needed to use the Selenium driver that was a bit more flaky and they were longer, but we did want to cover those cases. But the deal, to go off on a bit of a digression, the deal with Rails server-rendered web apps using this Capybara tool was that, the request response cycle of server-rendered pages is very deterministic. And so, automating those, like you knew when the process was done because you received your response. Like there was no asynchrony going on there. I think also the DOM, I think it allows the UI to be scripted more reliably than native platforms because it's a standard, like it's a published standard, and everything there is a DOM element. Whereas like on the native platform, I've got different views, but maybe my navigation controller, like my iOS stack navigation, it works in just a different way. And so like it's kind of indirect. Like how do I refer to that element? How do I pull it up? It can just be trickier, certainly trickier to come and add in tests after the fact. So yeah, I think the constraints on the web are just different. And this relates to cost and benefit. So if it is in fact easier and more consistent and more reliable to create end-to-end tests on the web, then you don't need as much benefit to make the cost worth it. And so you might reach for them much more often. Whereas on mobile, like because of the possibility of flakiness, because of the effort of figuring out how to target things on the screen, maybe you're more likely to save it just for those absolutely critical paths on mobile. And that trade-off makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind is that most of the engines that you're running things on the web tend to be the same engines, right? I mean, Safari and Chrome and now Edge, because Edge is moving to Chromium, I'll use WebKit, right? And so if you're going to run into a problem, you're most likely, unless they've modified WebKit or doing something on top of it, it's probably going to be a problem with WebKit, right? To a certain degree.
Right.
I mean, there are UI things, there are plugin things, right? And so that complicates it. And boy, do the plugins complicate things on the web. But that said, I mean, in the mobile space, the other thing you run into is the same kind of issue, except it's, okay, well, here's the Android kernel, but what version of Android and what are the resources that it can run and all these things, the iPhones seem to be a little bit more standardized or a lot more standardized, but you can still run into weird stuff, right? How old is the phone and what kind of memory does it have? And, how much space is on it and things like that. Most people update to the latest version, but are they on an old phone that won't update to that version? And so there are still things there too. And it's interesting to say, okay, what do we support and what do we ignore? And so, yeah, there's that. The other thing is that your iPhone apps or your Android apps, your mobile apps are much more tied to the hardware than you run into in the web. Because if it'll run in the web browser, it'll run in the web browser, right? It may take it longer to load if you didn't build it right, but it'll still eventually get there. And so that the concerns are different, but in the same vein, you can kind of line them up. Some of them are pretty similar, but yeah, when you're running on the metal like you are on a mobile device, it changes the game a little bit because you're worried now about memory management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and your browser does all that for you on the web.
It's so interesting, the different perspective as someone like me as a web developer who has come into mobile application development versus a mobile application developer who's coming over onto the web or adding web to their skill set. Mm-hmm. So I'm used to the constraints of the web. It's like, oh, these are the kinds of things that I can build. This is how my brain even thinks about what an application is. Yeah. And cool, I can do that on mobile as well. And oh, look, I've got these bonus APIs. Like I can hook into this, I can hook into that. But it's like the kinds of things that I'm thinking of doing with a mobile application are very similar to what you can do on the web. Versus a mobile developer starting with, the sky's the limit for the things that they could do. And for them looking at a web browser, it's like, okay, like that is a very small subset. And so like as they think about like developing web applications or whether they would, or when they just think about like, hey, can I automate everything to do here? It's like, well, there's so many things in mobile development that like, how would you automate checking that the right sound is playing? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't think about that on the web, even though it is built into the web, because I just think about, links to click and forms and is an image displayed on the screen. So I think just paradigms of the breadth of like what is an application differs. And so, of course, everything that we've discussed could be very different depending on if you're building a game on iOS or a life-critical pacemaker system or something like that. It's the types of applications differ a lot.
Yeah, I've been playing lately with the web audio APIs in Electron. And they even think about those things differently, right? So we're talking about like an actual device that it has to connect to, this being a microphone or a camera, right? And on the phone, it's just built in because it's built into the phone. And here it's, okay, well, you've got to get permission. And, and then once you have permission, and they do that on the phone too, to some degree. But once you're there, then it's just not as straightforward because it's not a common use case there either. And so you're dealing with all these different things. Coming back around, though, to talk a little bit more about QA versus development and, where the testing boundaries are. To some degree, I think this is an organizational decision, right? You kind of have to define whose job ends and the other begins, right? And so for me, at least, the organization needs to sit down and say, okay, the developer's job, for example, is to write working code. And so insofar as the UI automation falls under that, then they should be doing it, right? And, you can fine tune those roles a bit, right? But to a certain degree, I mean, if the developer's not writing working code, then the QA's job gets a whole lot harder, right? And then on the other end, the QA's job is to make sure that the customer has a good experience, right? So again, to the degree that the QA team needs to do UI automation or end-to-end testing, or whether or not they're just going to, go through and tap or click or whatever on their end, their job is to make sure that's happening. And as long as everybody's filling their roles, I don't see that one necessarily precludes the other from participating in one way or the other, right? It's hey, look, you do your job and you do your job, figure out how you're going to do it. And yeah, I mean, if you're both doing UI automation, then sit down together and don't duplicate effort. But other than that, I don't see that QA should be threatened by the idea of UI automation, nor should the developers feel like they can't do UI automation because it's QA's job, right? I definitely see this as in the wheelhouse of both, but an organization could define it completely differently and say, no, UI automation is clearly the realm of one or the other. And so it's interesting because it's like, look, we have this shared concern is where I see it. And, so should one or the other be doing it? Well, I think that in a lot of ways is an organizational decision. And I opt, at least for me and in my organizations, I opt for your job is to make these kinds of things happen. And then I let them figure it out. Right. And so in this case, I would almost expect that QA and development would sit down together and say, we're going to do some UI automation on some of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I've been learning is just figuring out what it is that each of us is looking for and to what degree, I was like, hey, I'm writing end-to-end tests. Oh, you're going to write end-to-end tests? Cool. Like we're doing the same thing. Let's help each other out. And in my head, it was all in the same category. And I had some understanding of like, hey, I certainly don't know QA's job. Like I certainly am not intending to dictate anything to y'all about what you need. But it did fall into the same category for me.
Yeah.
Whereas some of the things that I've been learning as we've been asking questions and discussing together is like what needs are at least somewhat different. I think one of the biggest things I've learned is, at least in our approach, we will develop features over a sprint. We'll do one or maybe several builds that are released to QA over the course of a 2-week sprint. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, when QA gets the build, that's when their testing can begin. Now, maybe, on this project, we're just ramping up the QA automation. So maybe they will have written those automated tests in advance, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll start when they get the build. But either way, the running of it won't happen until we produce the build and they have it.
Yeah.
So that's the point that feedback comes in. So for the developers, what I'm looking for, and coming out of my web circles, especially this feedback that I've gotten, was to have some of these tests run on CI on each pull request. Mm-hmm. And so whether I'm doing test-driven development, which I prefer, where I write the feature test for that feature that I'm building, or whether I write it afterwards, or even just adjust existing end-to-end tests that are there to make sure they keep passing, like I want the feedback at the same time that the PR is running, that not only are my units of code working as expected, but those user flows are working as well.
Yeah.
So the timing of that feedback is a difference in what I'm kind of looking for. I think also I mentioned like the stubbing out of the back end, where I'm kind of going with Cypress's advice, where it's like, hey, right now in this context, I'm not actually testing end to end. I want to look at our application, like this specific React Native application, and to see if it's succeeding. Like we'll get the backend integration later, but let me stub it out here, and that increases the reliability. Like if our QA process lets us say, hey, here's our percentage of passing tests, and it's fine. Like we know we haven't fully gotten this one deterministic, or the backend was down at the day we ran this test, so like now we know, and here's the report. Versus if my CI will fail if the test doesn't pass, then that's a problem. And that's going back to what I was saying about those tests in Capybara in the Rails world, because those were server rendered pages, they were very reliable and very deterministic. Yes. And so we ran almost all of them almost all the time, and every CI run they were fast as well. Mm-hmm. And so they failed to build. So whether maybe we wouldn't, have quite as many developer end-to-end tests for React Native, or maybe we'd have different groupings of them or something. Right. But whatever I do run on CI, I want it to be some kind of reasonable time frame. So at least by the time like the code review is done, that it'll be passed and ready to go. And I want to be able to say, hey, whatever those tests I'm running on CI, they all pass. Like we cannot merge until they're passing. So that's the kind of test that I want there.
Yeah, and I think that's just another part of the same conversation, right? Is what role does each part of your process play, right? What part does CI play? What part does CD play, right? Continuous deployment. And I've seen mobile teams do continuous deployment, right? So it gets thrown onto a CI machine. It runs all the tests. It assumes everything's good. And then it deploys the app, right? It pushes it to the app stores. And, a lot of times that works and it allows you to iterate quickly, So just as quickly as you introduce a bug, you can introduce a fix. So yeah, I think really it does come down a lot to just what are you looking for from this, right? And so you're talking about CI in a very specific use case where it's like, look, the CI's job is to tell me something's broken, right? Reliably tell me something's broken. So I don't want false positives. I don't want false negatives. And I don't want it to report on anything that doesn't speak to whether or not the app is working. And so if I put in an end-to-end or UI automation test that isn't specific to that output, then it's a waste, right? That may be something, it may fall under what QA's role is, right? And so QA may have their own system that they run it through. But, for my uses, for the role that I'm, putting CI in, that's the way that I'm looking at it.
Yeah. And another difference that comes to mind is, and I may have alluded to this earlier, if the focus in developer test is, hey, like, did I build out the right features? And it's like, okay, well, I'm running on React Native. Like React Native should run on iOS and Android. I would definitely want, if I had a cross-platform app, I definitely want to run those
Yes.
UI automation tests on both. I would not want to assume that both of those work because there's so many platform differences. But like, if it should run on a bunch of different Android devices, it's like, well, on my CI, like on my PRs, I probably don't feel the need to run on a bunch of different Android versions.
Right.
But maybe, before the release, maybe when we create a build and send it over to QA, maybe they would run on a bunch of different versions of the most primary supported ones. And so there's a level of assumptions that we make on like, hey, like React Native should run on a bunch of different Android devices. I mean, same if you're building a native app, like, hey,
right.
like this Android UI library should run just fine on a bunch of different devices. That's good enough for CI to merge the feature down, but It's not good enough. Like, we want to manually or automatically test on our suite of test devices to double check at that point. But it's not something that we want to slow down CI for. Or even if you're using the tools, and this is something that QA said is like, hey, like, for Appium for developer tests, like, Appium's really great. Like, it may not have the reliability that you need for those CI for the PR approvals. And it's like, hey, that makes a lot of sense. They have experience with this. They know. Yeah. So it's like, hey, let's get that breadth of testing there that Appium can provide us in the suite that QA runs, but let's not introduce that to CI because that will that non-determinism is going to undercut any of the benefits that we would have hoped to get from it running in that environment.
Yep. Now, there's one other thing that I kind of want to talk about here, because you're talking about using QA's expertise to, expand what you're doing and make sure that you're doing things in the proper way. And I really like that. I've also been on teams where the developers hated QA because QA was always holding up the build, right? When I worked in QA at Mosey, I got in and we held up the build. I'm not kidding you, for 2 or 3 months. And this was after the acquisition. And so EMC was breathing down the neck of the COO or whatever he was at that point, general manager, to get a new version out. And we knew that there were a couple of critical bugs that hadn't been fixed, and the developers were working on them, right? We weren't putting any pressure on them, but it turned into this situation where everybody was kind of frustrated with us, right? Because we kept bringing up critical issues. The flip side is that I've also seen it where the development teams turn QA into a dumping ground, where essentially they write the feature, they add it into the app, and they kind of do a cursory run through, and then they push it over. And then QA is constantly bringing it back to them with problems. And, I've also seen it where, QA is a little bit aggressive about the way that they bring problems back. And so by coming to understand each other and what your roles are, and then having a clearly defined process for a lot of this, right? So if QA finds a bug, then they, do we classify it, as critical or, something we need to fix later, or, just kind of a nuisance that, next time somebody's in that code, go make it cleaner. If we can classify the bugs and then we have a process for each one, this one's a critical bug. It's a security bug. We can't release with it in there, blah, 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 versus, some of the other situations where, maybe it's, we're okay pushing it live because the bug was already in there and people have already been dealing with it, right? And we'll fix it in the next release. But, that keeps a lot of the animosity between the two groups from forming and allows instead better communication. So then the communication can be, hey, look, the process is getting in the way on this particular issue, so we're going to update the process. Or, hey, this doesn't fall squarely into our role in the company or yours, so let's expand the definition of one of our roles to take it on. Or, hey, you push this feature in, but it doesn't even work on anything, right? And so how do we update the process so that we're getting working code? Or just things like that. And so if you can communicate about that and you can communicate a little bit dispassionately about some of these issues, then you can get a long way toward making it work. And then you can make both the development team and the QA team an asset in making sure that your code's reliable.
That's really encouraging to hear, because I think the positive, the collaborative aspect is just what we're experiencing right now on my client. Yeah. And so that's really great. And like the QA engineers are on our team, they sit with us, they work with us. Yeah. It's not this big separation. I just have so many positive experiences working on small teams where the people and you talk and you decide together. And it's not it's just, I have totally been there. So I totally understand the temptation, but thinking at it from the outside, the idea of, QA is holding up the bill because they identified this defect. It's like the idea of blaming QA is baffling to me, because it's like the defects, like that behavior is there, like in the code. And so it's like it's the definition of shooting the messenger. But I think in large organizations, there could be organizational things that happen and incentives and communication paths that make those kind of misunderstandings inevitable. And I don't know how to solve it for large organizations, but I love small teams and I love working closely and communicating in just the way you said, and just the getting to know one another so that you know the standpoint that it comes from, and that that you really are working together as a team. Like, hey, we all want to get this release done, and we all know the constraints we're operating under, and like, what's the best we can do for right now, and how can we improve things in the future?
Yep. And just by keeping the communication lines open, I mean, even in larger organizations, what the problem really breaks down to is communication. And so, even if you have to circumvent the sort of, and I know I'm telling people to break the rules, but if you have to circumvent the normal means of communication to get the things done and to make things work, sometimes you just do. And if that's what it takes, then that's what it takes. But the thing is at the end of the day, you're getting the job done, you're doing it right, and you're avoiding a whole lot of frustration with the people or the process or anything else. And so, just make sure that you keep those lines of communication open and, do the best you can to understand the people on the other side of it, because ultimately you're all working for the same goal. And if you can make that collaboration as seamless as possible and understand where everybody's at, that just goes a long, long, long way.
Yeah.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
As we move forward towards kind of wrapping up the episode, I just want to give major props to Wix for developing Detox. Same for the Cypress team for their startup creating this tool. Cypress in particular hits upon just the transformational nature that can happen when you have new tooling that's different, that solves problems in a different way. And I think that's true to a large degree. Like once the cost goes down, the number of times you can reach for the benefits of these tools goes way up. And like whatever organizational communication things need to happen, the better the tools we have, the better off we are. And I think these two tools in particular do an amazing job at allowing us to create more reliable software. And that means we can deploy it more frequently. And it's not just about, oh, cool, you got an update sooner. It means we can get a security fix in really quick before people's data is compromised. And it means we can, as a startup or as a large company, we can do an experiment, put it out there, find out what's working, what's not working, and change it. And so there's just real paradigm shifting changes to the ways we can build software. And again, I gave a meetup talk one time about the kind of life of worry that I had before I had automated testing and before I had agile development. And I would never want to go back there. And it's why I'm so passionate about teaching about testing, is because I want people to benefit from these as much as they can. And like, hey, like if you're on a platform different from me, if you're doing really in-depth mobile development and there's constraints that I don't know about, like more power to you. Like, good luck. Like, let me know if I can help you brainstorm. If you have different organizational constraints and needs, like, hey, work within those and figure out what's the best for your team. But like, when Detox and Cypress create these new tools, it's just pure removal of cost. It just gives us more options to design these solutions together and just make better software and make people's lives better. So thanks to all those folks for doing the hard, low-level work of building these tools and coming up with creative solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the tools do make a difference. And, in some ways, like you said, some of these tools are going to be new, right? They're gonna be coming out, and Detox, and then somebody's going to look at Detox and they're going to be like, oh, well, I wish it did this better. And then realize that there are constraints within Detox that make it harder for it to do it better. And so they go make their own tool. And then now we have two great tools, right? So, that's the other thing is, don't be afraid to look at the system and find a better way to do things.
Definitely. Do you have anything else about this you want to discuss? I think that covers my kind of questions and things I'm exploring right now.
No, not particularly. The only other thing that I've seen with some of this is that, so when I was working QA, we had half the team in Utah, or two of us in Utah, and there were like 4 or 5 other people in India that we were working with, because we got acquired by EMC Corporation. And so they handed a lot of the QA work off to these other folks. They didn't decrease our headcount at all to do it. They just added resources, right? And, they were terrific people on, basically on the other side of the ocean. They were 12 and a half hours or 11 and a half hours, depending on how you look at it, removed from us. And so we'd either show up at 6 in the morning or we'd stay until 6 or 6:30 in the evening to talk to them. And again, that communication became really, really important. The nice thing about it, though, was that we could go home and we could come back and get a report on what tests they had run while we were asleep. And, same thing for us, right? So then they'd come back around and we could give them feedback and get feedback from the developers and the other people on the development team. And so I guess my point is twofold. One is that you may be dealing with people that are not even in the same building, in the same state, or in the same country as you, or in the same time zone as you. And there are ways to make that work, right? So don't get disheartened by that. And the other thing is that honestly, that communication is so crucial, especially in those situations. So if you are looking at a situation, where we didn't describe every aspect of what you're looking at, just sit down with the people involved and just say, look, how do we make sure that we are doing the best job we can so that we understand where the other's coming from? We know what's going on. There aren't any surprises, because usually that's where people get hung up is, oh, wow, I didn't expect that. And it really kind of, it's painful to deal with in some way. And so, yeah, if you can get to that place where you're actually communicating about it and, hey, here's the Slack channel or whatever that we're going to communicate in, or here's the this, that, or the other, right? Here are the terms under which you should call me in the middle of the night, if that's necessary, right? Because, they're 12 hours off. So middle of the afternoon, they need an answer. It's 2 a.m. here. Well, maybe they actually do need to call me. So, just make sure that you're thinking through it. And then the other thing that I would put out there is, with all of these processes, especially across multiple teams or multiple roles, is don't be afraid to examine the process and make it better. Josh mentioned agile development, and those ideas apply here. They apply more here, because if everybody's working generally on the same thing in the same role, it's really easy to talk about it with the other people because everybody has the same concerns. And if you're in different roles, then you need to be working in a place where you're communicating more and you're making the process work for you more. And everybody's plugged in a little bit different spot on the process. And so if the process isn't working, then give yourselves permission to talk about it and change it.
Yeah, I think that's the idea of a retrospective when it really works well. And projects I've had where retrospective is really motivating is we say, hey, here's what's going well, here's what's not going well this past sprint or whatever. And then it's like in places where it's motivating to do a retro is things where it's like people decide as a team, like, cool, okay, here's what we're going to do differently this next sprint.
Yeah.
In other teams and in organizations where through no fault of anybody on the team necessarily, it's like, oh, well, this is really painful. well, we can't really change it because we don't have administrator access, or this is the thing, or leadership requires this to be reported, or things like that. And so that's actually not a problem with the retro. Now that I think about it, it's a problem with the fact that like you're in just an organization where for one reason or another, change is harder. Like it's just harder to bring about changes. And so it's not that the retrospective is unmotivating. It's that it's surfacing the fact that your team's under constraints that it seems like you can't really do much about. But yeah, so I would encourage folks to do a retrospective and try to make a change. And even if it's pushing back, like, it's, we're tempted to just suffer under, this is the way it is. Like this is the inter-team communication process or the software deployment process or whatever, even though it's painful. But like, raise the question and push back and explain, as you were saying, like the reasons why, explaining like this is the benefit that the whole team is going to get and the end customer is going to get if we can put this or that in place. And that'll lead to motivating retrospectives, I think. Yeah.
And I've been in organizations too, where we essentially had to work around those constraints. Like we went outside the approved system that the organization had given us to make it work. And, that's hard too, because then you don't have any support. And sometimes there's some risk involved. If they find out that we're doing this, it's not going to go well. But, I've been in organizations where that's what it took. And so, I'm not necessarily encouraging people to skirt what their boss would want or something, or put their job at risk. But just keep in mind that some organizations aren't going to bend. And if they're not going to bend, your options are find another way or leave. And so, but for the most part, organizations are made of people. And, I found that for the most part, if you can make the case, a lot of times you can get the change you need. So, yeah. All right. Well, should we do some picks?
Let's do it.
All right.
You go first.
Yeah. Why don't you go first?
Cool. My picks this time. The first one, interestingly, is parallel to testing, but it's a different topic, and it's the topic of code review. So I say that's another practice that since starting at Big Nerd Ranch that I've been doing. I mean, it's for some folks, even like code school graduates, it's like, what do you mean you never did code review before? But we just literally like, you built your code and you checked it in, and then I built my separate code in another part of the app, and we just hoped that it worked. And this was back in the days of no automated tests, by the way. So you can imagine how well that went. But I say to folks, as much as I'm obsessed with automated testing, I would be willing to do without it on a certain project with the right platform, the right constraints. But I don't think I could do without code review anymore. It's just the benefits that I've seen from having somebody else, and specifically I have in mind here at pull requests, work on, a single feature, kind of atomic unit of user-facing work, push it up in a pull request, describe it. Somebody else on the team looks at it, or if you're a one-person team, like somebody else from another team in your organization looks at it, gives feedback, you make enhancements, and just the learning that comes from that, the catching of bugs you wouldn't otherwise catch, the opportunity to clarify the code. And the really tangible thing that it comes down to is, you're going to be on vacation someday, and somebody else on your team, well, let's flip it around. Somebody else on your team is going to be on vacation someday. You're going to get the bug in the code that they wrote, and you want to have seen it before. Or if you haven't seen it, you want somebody else, a third party who have seen it, to have encouraged them to name things clearly and to get things consistent with the way it behaves is the way that it looks like it behaves, so that the code is more maintainable. And so the benefits that I've seen from code review are just, I can't estimate how big they are. Now, I know some folks have worked in places where it's a really discouraging experience and you just get like really, criticized and demeaned in code reviews. And that's terrible. I hope I never work in a place like that, or I hope that I do so I can push back to make it better. So code review, if you've been turned off in that way, doesn't have to be like that. It can be a place where you encourage one another to say, hey, this is a really cool solution. I haven't seen this language feature before, or I wouldn't have thought about handling this case. Good job. Or asking clarifying questions like, why did you do this way? Oh, cool. Now I understand. Thank you. So it doesn't just need to be changes that you're requesting. So I'll stop there. Maybe we could have a whole discussion someday about code review.
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah. I advocate code review. I think it's really great. The other thing that's maybe controversial is Slack. A lot of hate on Slack. A lot of people don't like it. Some people who are influential that I respect their views in many ways are down on it. And I respect their views on it, but I find it to be very positive. We are about half of our company right now is local to Atlanta, but half of us are remote. I am far enough from the office that I'm effectively remote. And so we are sort of a remote first company in that sense. All of our meetings have a video. Everybody always signs onto the video when they join a meeting, and unless you know for sure that everybody's going to be local there. helps us work with clients that aren't in Atlanta. Maybe they're somewhere else. And so we work that way. And so we end up going with asynchronous processes. So everything is tracked in a story tracker. All code review does happen in pull requests. We try to, use channels on Slack for conversations to happen so that others can see them later. And it's like, oh, cool, now I've learned that. Oh, I can chime in with some perspective that the two of you didn't have. And so I think that's really beneficial. So we find a lot of productivity from it. I know the folks that tend to have really bad experiences with Slack and other chat tools like that is it's another inbox I have to read. There's stuff happening all the time. I'm expected to be logged in. I'm expected to be reading. And I just get harangued from all these different places, just people requesting all these different things. So some of it is situational. Like I know as a consultancy where we have a lot of small teams working on client projects, we often don't have a lot of demands for one another. Like our client project is where we're committed to be. And then in our kind of other channels, like our kind of web development wide channel or React Native wide channel is totally optional. You just chime in if and when you want. You can put the word out there, say, hey, I'm running into this. Has anybody seen this? And there's no expectation that people respond. So I certainly don't say that everybody should be using Slack or needs to be, and I don't have a solution for all the negative experiences that some folks have, but it can be done well in the right organization. And we've really enjoyed it and benefited from a ton. I mean, as a remote developer, I would just feel so disconnected from my teams if I didn't have this way to chat with folks throughout the day and, chat in channels about sharing pictures of our kids or dogs or talking about scary movies around Halloween time. So my personal experience with Slack is really positive. I'm sure most of our listeners have probably heard about it, but I just wanted to share that it's been a good thing for us. Nice. And those are my picks.
Yeah. We use Discord on my team. But yeah, a lot of the same things that you're saying, apply there. So for the shows this year, this year leading into Christmas, and I know that some of the episodes are probably going to come out after Christmas, but for the shows this year, I've been picking Christmas movies. And specifically, I'm picking Christmas movies that are a little on the older side. So there are just a lot of great classic movies that are awesome that I'm going to pick. And so I'm going to throw those out there, and then I'm going to throw out a pick to the book. So if you're, on the job hunt or you want to just have that flexibility, because it talks you about how to get in the door. But those things essentially, a lot of them apply to just being in a good position to know somebody to just, go pull the trigger and, and get a job on a moment's notice, if you get laid off or, something goes down at work. So yeah, anyway, the first pick that I have, and I'm curious, so listeners, you can answer, Josh, if you know the answer to this, of course, you're looking at the chat, so you probably know the answer to this. It's in there. I wonder if people know what movie the song White Christmas first appeared in.
I think I would have known the answer if you hadn't posted it, because my wife and I have seen both of those movies.
Right.
But I'll stall for just a second while people are thinking, and you can pause the podcast if you want to rack your brain.
Yeah. So my first pick, I guess I'll pick the other movie. The other movie is actually called White Christmas, and it has Bing Crosby and Danny Kaye in it, and it is hilarious. It is such a fun movie. Absolutely love that movie. It's one of the go-tos every year that I just really, really enjoy watching. And it's, it was made in the 1950s, and it's awesome. But the song White Christmas actually first appears in Holiday Inn, which also features Bing Crosby. And it's an awesome movie. I really, really love both movies. And so if you're looking for kind of a different movie than what you're used to, because a lot of the Christmas movies are kind of the, Santa and his elves and, all kinds of stuff. Yeah. Holiday Inn has Bing Crosby and Fred Astaire in it. And yeah, so definitely go check it out. Holiday Inn was made in 1942. So it's actually, 10 years older than 12 years older than White Christmas. But yeah, Holiday Inn is them coming back from the war, if I remember right. And they go through a whole bunch of stuff. It's honestly, it's one of my favorites. And then yeah, the other one is like I said, White Christmas. And it's a different pace, and it's much more Christmas focused. Holiday Inn it definitely has a lot of Christmas in it. And so I think of it as a Christmas movie, but it covers a lot of other stuff too. So anyway, definitely go check those out. Bing Crosby's one of those classic people. Just go watch a movie he's in. Terrific singer, terrific performer. Watching Fred Astaire dance is just fun. So yeah, I'm going to pick those. And then, yeah, I put a link in the show notes as well to the book. You can go get it on Amazon. When this goes live, it'll be up. By then, I should also have it available for you to order a print book if you want one. And you can also go get the audio book. I should have the audio book done by then as well. So, yeah, those are my picks. And yeah, I don't know if we have anything else, Josh.
No, I think we're good. I advocate for those movies as well. I saw Holiday and just once, I think, and I think it was good. But White Christmas is in our yearly rotation, so it is quite hilarious. So it's a lot of fun.
Yep. Yeah, I have a couple more that I'm definitely going to be picking over the next couple of weeks. And then I'll probably lay off after Thanksgiving because we're on like a 1 to 2 week on some of the shows release cycle. And so then I'd be picking Christmas movies into New Year.
Yeah. There's only a small subset of folks that will watch Christmas movies in January, but they're there.
Yeah. And yeah, if you get these in January, put them on your list and watch them next year, or just go watch them. I mean, heck, they're great movies. So
yeah.
All right, folks. Well, we'll have another show for you next week. And in the meantime, max out.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.